What happens when a perfect life is built on a foundation of secrets? For billionaire Damien Blackwood. He had it all: a loving, pregnant wife, a global empire, and a future that seemed limitless. But he also had a mistress, Isabel, a woman who wouldn't settle for second place. In a final desperate act of malice, Isabel poisoned a pastry meant to destroy Eleanor and her unborn child. But she never planned for one thing, that on that fateful night, the billionaire would be the one to take the fatal bite. This isn't just a story of an affair gone wrong. It's a story of how one bite of a poisoned dessert brought a titan to his knees and exposed a truth more toxic than any poison. The fork was halfway to his mouth when his wife Eleanor laughed softly in her sleep from the other room. The sound, a gentle murmur that always reminded him of wind chimes, made Damien Blackwood pause. He smiled. Even in her dreams, she was happy. He was the reason for that happiness, and the thought was a more potent fuel than any billion-dollar deal he had ever closed. On the marble island of their Park Avenue penthouse, under the soft glow of a single recessed light, sat the object of his late-night craving, a lemon ricotta pastry dusted with powdered sugar, so fine it looked like a fresh coat of winter snow. It was Eleanor's. Specifically, it was the one she had been saving for breakfast. She had a list of pregnancy cravings, a mile long. But this particular pastry from a small artisanal bakery downtown called Le Petit Four was her reigning favorite. She claimed their ricotta was whipped with the tears of angels. Damien, who usually ran on black coffee and ambition, found himself uncharacteristically hungry. A brutal 13-hour negotiation with a Japanese tech firm had left him drained his mind, still buzzing with leveraged buyouts and hostile takeovers. He had crept into the apartment, shedding his Tom Ford suit like a second skin, desperate for the quiet sanctuary of his home. And there it was, a perfect golden brown pastry on a delicate china plate left on the counter, a beacon of simple pleasure in his overly complicated world. "She won't mind," he whispered to the silence, his voice a low rumble. "I'll buy her a dozen tomorrow." He slid the tines of the fork into the flaky crust. The crisp sound was satisfying. He brought the bite to his lips, the sweet scent of lemon zest and vanilla filling his senses. It was a taste of his life, with Eleanor sweet, perfect, and profoundly comforting. He chewed, swallowed, and for a fleeting second, everything was perfect. Then the fire started. It wasn't a burn like hot coffee. It was a chemical searing blaze that erupted in his throat as if he'd swallowed acid. He gasped, dropping the fork with a clatter that echoed in the cavernous kitchen. His hand flew to his neck, his airway constricting with terrifying speed. A wave of dizziness washed over him, the sleek minimalist lines of his multi-million-dollar kitchen blurring into a nauseating swirl. He tried to call her name. Eleanor. But the only sound that escaped was a choked, guttural rasp. His vision tunneled. The single light above him became a blinding supernova. He stumbled backward, his legs suddenly made of jelly, and crashed against the sub-zero refrigerator. The magnets holding a dozen ultrasound photos, tiny, ghostly images of their future son, scattered and fell around him like confetti at a funeral. His heart hammered against his ribs, a frantic, irregular drumbeat. It felt like a bird trapped in his chest, violently beating its wings against a cage. A cold sweat beaded on his forehead. This wasn't food poisoning. This wasn't an allergic reaction. This was something else. This was an execution. His last coherent thought before the world dissolved into blackness was of the pastry, of Eleanor, and of the horrifying, impossible realization that the bite he had just taken was never meant for him. 6 months earlier, Eleanor Vance had thought her life was a fairy tale. The daughter of a respected, though not particularly wealthy, art history professor, she had met Damien Blackwood at a fundraiser for the Metropolitan Museum of Art. He hadn't been surrounded by a flock of sycophants, as she'd expected. Instead, he was standing alone in a quiet alcove, utterly captivated by a small, unassuming Degas sculpture of a ballet dancer. She, a specialist in French Impressionism, had approached him with a comment about the sculpture's unusual patina. He had turned, and his eyes, the color of stormy grey seas, seemed to look straight through her, not at her designer dress or her carefully coiffed hair, but into the very essence of her being. They talked for 2 hours, ignoring the champagne and canapes, lost in a world of art history and an immediate electrifying connection. He courted her with a ferocity that matched his business dealings. He didn't just send flowers. He had her favorite lilies stargazers flown in from the Netherlands and planted in a private rooftop garden he had commissioned for her. He didn't just take her to Paris. He arranged a private after-hours tour of the Musée d'Orsay, just the 2 of them, a bottle of 1982 Petrus, and a collection of Monets that made her weep. His world was one of unimaginable wealth and power. Men twice his age deferred to him. His company, Blackwood Capital, had its tentacles in every major market across the globe. He was ruthless, brilliant, and demanding. But with Eleanor, he was different. He was tender, attentive, and vulnerable. He confessed that his relentless drive was a way of running from a lonely childhood, and that with her for the first time, he felt he had a place to stand still. They were married within a year in a surprisingly intimate ceremony at his family's estate in the Hamptons. 3 months after that, Eleanor was pregnant. Damien was ecstatic. The man who commanded boardrooms with icy authority melted at the sight of the first ultrasound. He started leaving work at 6, a feat his executive assistant Julian claimed was a miracle on par with the parting of the Red Sea. He would come home, place his hand on Eleanor's burgeoning belly, and talk to their son for hours, promising him the world, but more importantly, promising him a love he himself had never known as a child. Their life was a bubble of serene bliss, floating high above the grit and grime of the city below. But no bubble is impenetrable. Isabelle Dubois was a ghost from Damien's past, one he had mistakenly believed was long since exorcised. They had met years before Eleanor, when Damien was still building his empire, and his heart was encased in ambition. Isabelle was in the same world, a PR executive for a rival firm, with looks that could stop traffic, and a mind that was just as sharp and cynical as his own. Their relationship had been a whirlwind of passion and convenience, a partnership of 2 people who understood the transactional nature of life in the fast lane. It was thrilling, but it was hollow. When it ended, it was mutual, and Damien had thought amicable. He was wrong. Isabelle re-entered their lives with the subtlety of a serpent. She appeared at a charity gala Damien and Eleanor were hosting. She greeted Damien with a kiss on both cheeks that was just a little too familiar, her perfectly manicured hand lingering on his arm just a second too long. "Damien, darling." She had purred her voice like expensive whiskey. "It has been far too long." She turned her gaze to Eleanor, her smile a work of art, beautiful on the surface, but with something cold and predatory behind it. "And you must be Eleanor. I've heard so much about you. He always did have impeccable taste." The compliment was laced with a subtext that made Eleanor's skin crawl. He always did, as if Eleanor were just the latest acquisition in a long line of collectibles. Over the next few months, Isabelle became a persistent low-grade hum of anxiety in Eleanor's life. She would appear at the same restaurants, join the same philanthropic committees, and always find a way to steer the conversation back to her history with Damien. She'd share hilarious anecdotes from their past inside jokes that left Eleanor feeling like an outsider in her own marriage. "Oh, you must ask Damien to tell you about the time we got stranded in Monaco," she'd say, laughing, her eyes fixed on Eleanor's. "The things we had to do to get a helicopter, it was terribly scandalous." Damien was mostly oblivious. He saw Isabel as a part of his past, a network connection in the present. "She's harmless, Elle," he'd say, kissing Eleanor's forehead. "That's just how she is. All style, no substance." But Eleanor saw the substance. She saw the calculating envy in Isabel's eyes when she looked at Eleanor's baby bump. She heard the barely veiled venom in her voice. One afternoon, Isabel had stopped by the penthouse unannounced, bearing a ridiculously expensive gift for the baby, a cashmere blanket from Hermes. "I was just in the neighborhood," she'd said breezily. Mrs. Gable, their housekeeper of 20 years, who was fiercely protective of the family, had shown her in with a look of profound disapproval. As Isabel cooed over the nursery, she'd placed a hand on Eleanor's arm. "You know," Isabel had said, her voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper, "I have to commend you. It takes a brave woman to tether a man like Damien down. So many women have tried and failed." Her eyes flickered with a strange, intense light. "You have to be careful. A man like that, his appetites are vast. You have to be everything to him, or he'll find it somewhere else." It was a threat gift-wrapped as friendly advice. The day of the poisoning, the pieces clicked into place with horrifying clarity, but only in retrospect. Mrs. Gable had been preparing the dough for Eleanor's beloved pastries that afternoon. She was meticulously clean, her kitchen a stainless steel fortress of hygiene. She'd left the prepared dough to chill in the refrigerator for an hour. During that hour, the doorman had called up to say that a courier was downstairs with a package for Mrs. Blackwood. Eleanor had been on a conference call for the museum board and asked Mrs. Gable to go down and sign for it. The housekeeper was gone for no more than 10 minutes. It was enough time. Isabel knew the building's security codes. She knew Damien's schedule. She knew about the pastries Eleanor had mentioned her craving at a luncheon Isabel had crashed the week before. The poison was sophisticated, not a common rat poison or arsenic that would trigger immediate alarms. It was a rare plant-derived alkaloid, notoriously difficult to trace, and known in very niche toxicological circles to mimic the symptoms of a catastrophic stroke or heart attack. In a smaller dose administered to a pregnant woman, it was designed to induce violent uterine contractions, causing a miscarriage that could be tragically and plausibly blamed on preeclampsia or other natural complications. It was the perfect weapon for a murderer who wanted to remain invisible. But Isabel, in her meticulous sociopathic planning, had made one fatal miscalculation. She had assumed the pastry would be eaten by the person it was intended for. She had envisioned a scene of tragedy, a grieving husband, a lost heir, and a comforting friend herself swooping in to pick up the pieces. She never in her wildest dreams imagined that Damien Blackwood, a man who survived on coffee and ambition, would on that one specific night decide he wanted a bite of his pregnant wife's dessert. As Damien lay on the cold marble floor, his life fading with every skipped heartbeat, the first wail of a distant siren began to slice through the night air. Up in the master bedroom, Eleanor stirred from her pleasant dream, a frown creasing her brow. The clatter of the fork, followed by the heavy thud, had pierced the edges of her consciousness. "Damien!" She called out, her voice thick with sleep. Silence. A knot of unease tightened in her stomach. She swung her legs over the side of the bed, her movements clumsy with the extra weight of the baby. "Damien, is everything all right?" She walked into the hallway, the polished wood cool beneath her bare feet. The sight that greeted her in the kitchen would be seared into her memory forever. Her husband, her titan. The invincible center of her universe lay crumpled and unmoving on the floor. His face was a ghastly shade of blue. His eyes were open, but they were vacant, and next to his outstretched hand lay the half-eaten pastry. Eleanor's world didn't just crack, it exploded. Her scream was a raw, primal sound of pure agony, a sound that ripped through the silent penthouse and echoed out into the uncaring city. It was the sound of a fairy tale coming to its brutal, horrifying end. The scream was ripped from Eleanor's lungs, but the sound was swallowed by the thick, sound-proofed walls of the penthouse. For a frozen second, the world was silent again, save for the frantic thumping of her own heart. Then reality crashed back in. Training from a long-forgotten first aid course kicked in a ghostly echo from her college days. Check for breathing, check for a pulse. Her hands, trembling violently, went to his neck. His skin was clammy and cold. She felt for the carotid artery, pressing her fingers against the flesh where he'd so often nuzzled her. Nothing. A faint, fluttery, impossibly fast beat. Then nothing again. No, no, no. She chanted the words, a desperate prayer. She fumbled for her phone on the kitchen counter, her thumb smudging the screen with tears. 911. The operator's voice was calm, professional, a stark contrast to the chaos exploding in Eleanor's soul. "My husband, he's not breathing. He collapsed." She stammered, the words tumbling out. "Park Avenue, Penthouse A." The operator's instructions were a lifeline in a swirling vortex of panic. "Is he on his back? You need to start chest compressions." Chest compressions. On Damien. On her invincible husband, who had just this morning been laughing about how their son was already kicking like a future soccer star. The absurdity, the sheer horror of it, almost paralyzed her. But the thought of the tiny life inside her, a life that needed its father, propelled her into action. She knelt beside him, the cold marble seeping through her silk pajamas, linked her hands over his sternum as she'd been taught, and began to push. Hard and fast. 1 and 2 and 3 and 4. She counted aloud, her voice cracking each compression, a brutal impactut against the man she loved. The city's sirens grew from a distant cry to a deafening roar, a soundtrack to her worst nightmare. The paramedics were a whirlwind of controlled professional force. They swarmed the kitchen, their movements efficient and urgent. They took over compressions, attached a defibrillator, and started an IV line, their voices a clipped staccato of medical acronyms and drug dosages. Eleanor was gently but firmly moved aside, where she stood, wrapped in a cashmere throw a paramedic had draped over her shoulders, watching them fight for her husband's life. Charging to 200. Clear Damien's body convulsed on the floor. His eyes, still open and vacant, stared at the ceiling. No rhythm. Pushing 1 of epi. Eleanor's hand was protectively clamped over her stomach, as if she could shield her son from the trauma unfolding just feet away. She saw the half-eaten pastry, still sitting on the plate, a grotesque centerpiece in the tableau of horror. A paramedic, bagging Damien's personal effects, picked it up. Was he eating this? The paramedic asked, his tone neutral. Eleanor could only nod, a fresh wave of nausea rising in her throat. "We'll take it with us." The ride to Lenox Hill Hospital was a blur of flashing lights and the rhythmic whoosh of the ventilator that was now breathing for Damien. Eleanor sat in the front of the ambulance, her mind a blank slate of shock. In the emergency bay, Damien was wheeled away into the swirling vortex of the trauma unit, and she was guided to a small private waiting room reserved for families in crisis. Julian, Damien's ever-loyal executive assistant, arrived within 20 minutes, his usually impeccable suit rumpled and his face pale with shock. He'd been woken by the hospital's call. He handled the logistics, speaking in low, urgent tones on his phone, effectively creating a barrier between Eleanor and the administrative chaos. An hour later, a doctor with kind eyes and a weary expression entered the room. He introduced himself as Dr. Marcus Thorne, the head of emergency medicine. "Mrs. Blackwood," he began, his voice gentle. "We've stabilized him, but his condition is extremely critical. We've induced a therapeutic coma to minimize any potential brain damage from the lack of oxygen." His heart went into ventricular fibrillation. "Frankly, your quick action with CPR is likely the only reason he has any chance at all." Eleanor's knees felt weak. Julian guided her to a chair. "What happened? Was it a heart attack? A stroke?" Dr. Thorne hesitated. His brow furrowed. "That's what we're struggling to determine. The presentation is atypical. His cardiac enzyme levels are elevated, but not in a pattern consistent with a classic myocardial infarction. The initial CT scan shows some cerebral edema, but no signs of a major ischemic or hemorrhagic stroke. We're running a full toxicology panel, but the preliminary screen for common substances came back negative. Right now, we're treating the symptoms, but we don't have a definitive cause." The words hung in the air, heavy and ominous. Atypical. No definitive cause. It was then that the door opened again. Isabelle Dubois stood in the doorway, her face a mask of perfectly orchestrated anguish. Her couture trench coat was artfully disheveled, and her mascara was smudged just enough to look like she'd been crying, but not enough to be unattractive. "Oh my God, Eleanor," she breathed, rushing forward and enveloping Eleanor in a hug that felt like being wrapped in ice. "I came as soon as I heard. I was calling Damien's cell. No one was answering. I got a call from a friend at the mayor's office who'd heard the ambulance call. How is he?" "What happened?" Eleanor, numb and exhausted, allowed herself to be held. For a moment, the support felt real. "They don't know," she mumbled into Isabel's shoulder. "He just collapsed." Isabel pulled back her hands, gripping Eleanor's arms. Her eyes wide and searching scanned Eleanor's face. But was he ill? Did he complain about anything? What did he do tonight? Did he eat something strange? The question was rapid-fire intense. Julian, standing by the window, turned slowly, his gaze narrowing on Isabel. Eleanor shook her head. "No, nothing. He was fine. He ate a pastry. My pastry." Isabel's eyes widened, her performance flawless. "A pastry. Oh God. Food poisoning. Anaphylaxis. Is he allergic to something I don't know?" "They're running tests," Eleanor whispered. "We need to find out where that pastry came from," Isabel insisted, her voice taking on a tone of command. "Which bakery we need to call them. We need to have everything they sold today tested. Julian, you should handle that. Get on it immediately." She was directing the show a field marshal taking control of a chaotic battlefield, And it was in that moment, through the thick fog of her grief, that Eleanor felt the first tiny splinter of doubt. It wasn't what Isabel said, but how she said it. The intense focus on the food, the immediate leap to an external cause, the way she was already trying to manage the situation. It felt less like the panic of a concerned friend, and more like the damage control of a guilty party. Before Julian could respond, Mrs. Gable arrived. She was a small, stout woman whose posture was always ramrod straight, and her presence filled the room with a quiet, formidable gravity. She took one look at Isabel, clutching Eleanor's arm, and her lips thinned into a line of granite disapproval. She walked directly to Eleanor, ignoring Isabel completely, and placed a comforting, steady hand on her shoulder. "The doctor sent me back. He said you need to be checked, my dear. For you and the little one," she said softly, her voice a warm balm. She then looked at Julian. "The police are at the penthouse. They'd like to speak with Mrs. Blackwood when she is able." Isabel's head snapped up. "The police?" Why, it was a medical emergency. Mrs. Gable's gaze finally settled on Isabel, and it was as cold as a winter tomb. "The doctors can't identify the cause, Miss Dubois. When a healthy man of 42 collapses and nearly dies for no discernible reason, it becomes a police matter. They are treating the apartment as a potential crime scene." The color drained from Isabel's face. For the first time, a flicker of genuine, unscripted fear flashed in her eyes before being quickly suppressed. It was a micro-expression lasting less than a second, but Eleanor saw it, and it was like a key turning in a lock. A nurse came to lead Eleanor to a private room for an examination. As she left, Mrs. Gable fell into step beside her. "Ma'am, the housekeeper," said her voice, barely a whisper. "I don't want to alarm you, but there is something you should know. When I went downstairs to sign for that package this afternoon, the doorman, Carlos, said it wasn't a courier. It was a woman. She handed him the package and said it was a gift for you, and she left before he could announce her." Eleanor stopped in the hallway. "A woman. Did he see her?" "He said she was wearing a large scarf and sunglasses, but he noticed her coat, a very distinctive beige coat. He said it looked very expensive." Mrs. Gable said, her eyes meaningful. Eleanor's mind flashed to Isabel, standing in the waiting room in her artfully disheveled and very expensive beige trench coat. "And the pastry, ma'am?" Mrs. Gable continued, her voice trembling slightly. "When I made the dough, I used the sugar from the ceramic jar on the counter, the one with the blue flowers. I use it every day. After I came back from the lobby, I noticed the lid wasn't on quite right. It was askew. I thought nothing of it at the time. I thought I'd just been careless." The splinters of doubt were coalescing into a sharp, terrifying certainty. The unannounced visit from Isabel days before, her oddly specific questions about Eleanor's cravings, the strange courier, the expensive coat, the jar lid askew. It was a chain of coincidences, so improbable it defied belief. Back in her private room, a kind, sharp-eyed obstetrician named Dr. Lena Chen checked her vitals and performed a brief ultrasound. The steady, rhythmic thump, thump, thump of her baby's heartbeat filled the quiet, quiet room. It was strong, healthy, perfect. Tears of relief streamed down Eleanor's face. Her son was safe. For now. "Your baby is doing beautifully," Mrs. Blackwood, Dr. Chen, said, her voice soothing. "But you need to rest. The stress you're under is immense." Dr. Chen, it turned out, was also consulting on Damien's case, her specialty being internal medicine, with an emphasis on toxicology. My husband, Eleanor, said, her voice suddenly clear and strong, the fog of shock replaced by a cold, hard resolve. Dr. Thorne said his condition is atypical. What does that mean? Dr. Chen looked at her, a flicker of professional respect in her eyes. It means the pieces don't fit. We are sending his blood work and a sample of the pastry you provided to a specialized lab. We need to run a full-spectrum gas chromatography mass spectrometry analysis. We're looking for something that wouldn't show up on a standard screen. Something exotic. Poison, Eleanor said. The word tasted like ash in her mouth. Dr. Chen didn't confirm or deny it. We are exploring all possibilities, she said carefully. Eleanor took a deep breath. The grieving wife was receding, replaced by someone else. A protector, a fighter. Damien had taught her about strategy, about seeing 10 moves ahead. Now she had to use those lessons to save him. Dr. Eleanor said, her gaze unwavering. There is a woman in the waiting room. Her name is Isabelle Dubois. I want you to get a sample from her. Her hair, her saliva from a coffee cup, anything. Tell her it's for a genetic comparison for a possible rare allergy. Tell her anything you want. But I need you to test her for the same thing you're testing my husband for. Dr. Chen blinked, surprised by the request's audacity and implication. She saw the look in Eleanor's eyes, not hysteria, but a chilling, calculated certainty. That is a very serious request, Mrs. Blackwood, and that is a very serious poison in my husband's veins. Eleanor countered, her voice dropping to a steely whisper. She was at my home. She knew what I ate. And I think she tried to murder my child. A silent understanding passed between the two women. Dr. Chen gave a single, almost imperceptible nod. Eleanor leaned back against the pillows, her hand resting on her belly. The fight for Damien's life had just begun. But a new, darker battle was also taking shape, the fight to expose the monster hiding in plain sight, the one wearing a couture coat and a mask of fake tears, waiting for her fairy tale to crumble. The 24 hours after Damien's collapse were a masterclass in controlled chaos orchestrated by Eleanor. The grief was still there, a monstrous weight in her chest, but it had been compressed into a diamond-hard core of purpose. She was no longer just the wife. She was the queen regent protecting a fallen king and his heir. She met with the lead police investigator in a sterile conference room, down the hall from the ICU. Detective Mike Harding was a man who looked like he'd been carved from granite and left out in the rain. His suit was rumpled. His face was a road map of cynical lines, and he had the weary eyes of a man who had seen the worst of humanity and was rarely surprised. He'd handled dozens of cases involving the city's elite and had a deep-seated skepticism for their dramas. Mrs. Blackwood. He began, his voice a low gravel. I understand this is a difficult time. We need to go over the timeline of yesterday evening. Eleanor didn't cry. She didn't waver. She met his gaze and laid out the facts with the precision of a surgeon. She detailed Damien's routine, her pregnancy craving for the specific pastry, and the exact sequence of events leading up to her 911 call. Then she leaned forward slightly. Detective, she said, her voice even and cold. This was not an accident. I believe a woman named Isabelle Dubois attempted to murder me and my unborn child. I believe she poisoned that pastry, and my husband ate it by mistake. Harding raised a skeptical eyebrow. That's a very serious accusation. It was a very serious poison, Eleanor countered. She recounted Mrs. Gable's story of the strange courier in the beige coat. She told him about the askew lid on the sugar jar. She described Isabel's bizarrely intense questioning in the waiting room and her fleeting expression of pure terror when she heard the police were involved. She was building a case brick by brick. Harding listened, his pen scratching notes on a small pad. He was accustomed to grieving spouses' pointing fingers, but there was a chilling coherence to Eleanor's story. And this Isabelle Dubois, what's her motive? Eleanor's composure finally cracked just for a second. A single hot tear escaped and traced a path down her cheek. She wiped it away angrily. She was my husband's mistress, years ago. I believe she never accepted that he chose me, our life, our son, over her. The admission was humiliating, a private shame laid bare in the harsh fluorescent light, but it was a necessary weapon. Harding's expression didn't change, but something shifted in his eyes. The motive clicked into place. This was no longer just a potential food poisoning case. This was classic. Love, jealousy, and a very, very rich husband. His interview with Isabel later that day was a study in contrasts. She had composed herself now the picture of tragic grace. She met him in the hospital's small chapel, a rosary clutched in her hand, claiming she was too distraught to be anywhere else. It's just a nightmare. Detective, she whispered, dabbing a silk handkerchief at her dry eyes. To think that poor Damien could have been struck down by something so random. A bad batch of flour, perhaps. It's terrifying. You seem very certain it was the pastry, Harding observed mildly. Well, Eleanor said that's what he ate, Isabel countered smoothly. It's the only logical explanation. Were you at the Blackwood residence yesterday? Ms. Dubois. A pause. A fraction of a second too long. No, of course not. I was in meetings all day, then I had dinner with a client. And you didn't send a package to Mrs. Blackwood? A package, no. Why would I? She lied, her smile pitying as if the detective were a confused child. Detective, my only concern right now is for Damien. And for poor Eleanor, of course. In her condition, the stress must be unbearable. Harding left the interview with the distinct feeling he'd been speaking to a cobra. A beautiful, charming, and utterly deadly cobra. Her denial about being at the building was a direct contradiction to the doorman's account. It was the first solid lie, a crack in her pristine facade. While Harding pursued the official channels, Eleanor initiated her own. She summoned Julian to her temporary command center, the hospital waiting room. His face was etched with exhaustion and worry for the man who was both his boss and his mentor. Julian, Eleanor said, her voice leaving no room for argument. I need you to do something for me. Something off the books. I need you to investigate Isabelle Dubois. I don't mean a simple background check. I want a deep dive. I want to know where she gets her money, who she talks to, where she's been for the last 3 months. I want to know her secrets. Use whatever resources you have to. I know Damien trusts you to be discreet. Julian looked from Eleanor's steely eyes to the ICU door, behind which his boss was fighting for his life. His loyalty to Damien was absolute, and at that moment, that loyalty transferred completely to the woman trying to save him. Consider it done, Mrs. Blackwood, he said, his voice firm. For the next 48 hours, a silent war was waged. In the ICU, Dr. Chen's team worked tirelessly to stabilize Damien's volatile heart rhythm and reduce the swelling in his brain. He remained in the coma, a silent, still figure tethered to life by a web of wires and tubes. Eleanor sat by his bedside for hours on end, reading him articles from the Wall Street Journal and whispering updates about the baby, her voice a constant reassuring presence in the sterile silence. She willed him to fight to come back to her. Meanwhile, Julian moved through the city's underbelly of private investigators and data brokers with the quiet efficiency of a shark. He called in favors Damien had spent a decade accumulating. He bypassed legal channels accessing financial records and phone logs that would have taken the police weeks to obtain warrants for. 2 days later, he returned to the hospital and handed Eleanor a slim black folder. "I think you'll want to read this," he said, his face grim. Eleanor opened it. The contents made her blood run cold. Isabel's life was a house of cards. Her PR firm, once a celebrated boutique agency, was hemorrhaging clients and was on the verge of bankruptcy. She was leveraged to the hilt with multiple mortgages on her apartment and staggering credit card debt, all carefully hidden behind a facade of luxury and success. The motive wasn't just jealousy. It was financial desperation. She didn't just want Damien. She needed his fortune to survive. But that wasn't the worst of it. Julian had uncovered a series of large, untraceable cash withdrawals over the past 2 months, totaling over $100,000. And he had found where the money went. He'd tracked her movements to a series of discreet meetings in Queens with a man named Dr. Alistair Finch. A quick search revealed Finch was a former professor of organic chemistry at Columbia, a brilliant mind who had been dismissed 5 years prior for academic fraud and unethical research. His specialty plant-based alkaloids and their applications in non-traditional pharmacology. He was a chemist for hire, a man with a genius-level intellect, no moral compass, and a need for cash. It was the smoking gun. Isabel hadn't just bought a poison. She'd commissioned a bespoke weapon from a master craftsman. As Eleanor was staring at a grainy surveillance photo of Isabel handing a thick envelope to the disgraced chemist, her phone rang. It was Dr. Chen. "Eleanor, can you come to my office?" "The results from the lab are back." Eleanor walked to the doctor's office, Julian's folder clutched in her hand like a talisman. Dr. Chen's face was somber. "We identified it," she said, sliding a printed report across her desk. "It's a complex compound. The primary agent is aconitine, likely derived from the wolfsbane plant. It's incredibly cardiotoxic. But it was mixed with a potent non-standard beta blocker, something to prevent the heart from responding to adrenaline. The combination is diabolical. It's designed to cause complete cardiac arrest while mimicking the symptoms of a natural event. It was also found in the pastry sample. Aconitine. Eleanor breathed the name, sounding like a medieval curse. "It gets worse," Dr. Chen said, her eyes filled with a grim sympathy. "We ran that allergy panel on Ms. Dubois. My lab tech is meticulous. He noticed a microscopic particulate on the coffee cup she drank from. It was a unique synthetic binding agent, something used to stabilize volatile organic compounds. It's not something you'd ever encounter in daily life. But it's a signature of Dr. Alistair Finch's published research. The chain was complete. Isabel's motive, her means, her connection to the weapon and the weapon maker. It was all there." Eleanor slid Julian's folder across the desk to Dr. Chen, who read the first page and looked up, her expression a mixture of horror and vindication. Eleanor's phone buzzed again. This time, it was Detective Harding. "Mrs. Blackwood, we have enough. With the tox report and the doorman's testimony, the DA has issued a warrant for the search of Isabel Dubois's apartment and office. We're moving in now." The net was closing. The lies were unraveling. The monster was about to be dragged into the light. Eleanor felt a surge of triumph, cold and fierce. She had done it. She had fought for him. She stood up, her mind racing. Planning her next move, a call to their lawyer, a statement for the press. But as she turned to leave Dr. Chen's office, a nurse from the ICU came running down the hall, her face flushed with excitement. "Mrs. Blackwood, Dr. Chen, you need to come. Now." Eleanor's heart leaped into her throat. "What is it? Is he—" The nurse was beaming, her eyes shining. "He's awake." Mr. Blackwood just opened at his eyes. The world returned to Damien Blackwood in fragments. First sound, the rhythmic beep of a machine he vaguely recognized as a heart monitor. Then sensation, a dull ache in his chest, and a coarse tube scratching the back of his throat. Finally, sight the blurry white expanse of a ceiling. He tried to speak, but the tube choked him. Panic flickered. He tried to lift his hand, but it felt impossibly heavy, weighted down by more than just gravity. Then another hand, warm and gentle, covered his. Damien Eleanor's voice. His anchor. He forced his eyes to focus, and her face swam into view. She was pale, with dark circles under her eyes, but her expression was one of fierce, radiant relief. He was alive. He was with her. The next few hours were a painful, disorienting blur of doctors, nurses, and the uncomfortable removal of the breathing tube. His voice was a raw, hoarse whisper. His memory was a fog bank, with a single searing image burning through it, the taste of lemon and ricotta followed by a fire in his throat. "What happened?" He rasped, his hand tightening on Eleanor's. Eleanor sat by his bedside, her posture radiating a strength he had never seen before. This wasn't the soft, ethereal art historian he had married. This was a warrior. She took a deep breath and told him everything. She told him about the poison aconitine, a word that sounded alien and horrifying. She told him about his heart stopping, about the coma, about the days of uncertainty. He listened, his mind struggling to process the impossible. Poison. Someone had tried to kill him. It made no sense. A business rival, an enemy he'd made in a ruthless takeover, who he whispered the question, hanging in the air between them. Eleanor's beautiful face, the face he cherished above all else, hardened with a sorrow so deep it pierced his heart. "The poison wasn't meant for you, Damien. It was in my pastry. The dose was calculated to make me lose the baby." Damien stared at her, the blood draining from his face. The horror of that statement was a physical blow worse than the poison itself. An attack on his wife, on his unborn son. A rage pure and absolute began to burn away the fog of his confusion. Who he repeated, his voice no longer a whisper, but a low, dangerous command. Eleanor hesitated for only a second before delivering the final, devastating truth. "Isabel." The name fell into the sterile silence of the room. Damien's mind recoiled. Isabel. His Isabel. Ambitious, cynical, passionate Isabel. It was impossible. He tried to deny it, to find another explanation. "No. Elle, you're mistaken. She wouldn't. She needed your money." "Damien." Eleanor said, her voice flat, devoid of emotion. "And she wanted my life." She didn't show him Julian's folder or the police reports. Instead, she just told him the facts. The chemist, the untraceable cash, the lie to the police, the synthetic binding agent found on her coffee cup. He saw in her eyes that it was the truth. And with that truth came a cascade of memories, reframed in a new horrifying light. Isabel's jokes about Eleanor, her lingering touches, her obsessive interest in his new life. He had dismissed it all as harmless drama, the theatricality of a past lover. He had been a fool, a blind, arrogant fool. The affair, long dead in his heart, had left behind a ghost with a venomous bite, and his blindness, his carelessness, had brought that ghost to his family's door. As this devastating realization settled over him, Detective Harding was executing his warrant. Isabel's apartment, a monument to curated luxury, was swiftly and systematically dismantled by the forensics team. Isabel watched a glass of champagne in her hand, her demeanor one of utter contemptuous outrage. "This is harassment," she spat at Harding. "When Damien wakes up, your career will be over." "He is awake, Ms. Dubois," Harding said calmly, watching her reaction. "And his wife has been very informative." A flicker of unease. "She's a hysterical, pregnant woman. She's paranoid." At that moment, a young tech officer called from the living room. "Got something, detective?" On her laptop. "Deleted browser history, but it's in the cache. Searches for aconitine dosage. Tasteless, fast-acting poisons. Effects of aconitine in pregnancy. And there's a file in a hidden partition, a draft of a press release, announcing a memorial fund in Eleanor and the baby's name to be managed by the Damien Blackwood Foundation. With you, Ms. Dubois, listed as the new acting chairperson." The champagne flute slipped from Isabel's fingers and shattered on the marble floor. Her face, for the first time, was a mask of pure, ugly fury. She had not only planned the murder, she had planned the succession. The arrest was swift. The fight drained out of her, replaced by a cold reptilian stillness. The mask of the socialite was gone, leaving only the predator beneath. Damien insisted on seeing her. His lawyers, the police, and Eleanor all protested, but the iron will that had built an empire was now focused on this one final confrontation. They brought Isabel to a secure conference room in the hospital. She walked in handcuffed, flanked by 2 officers. The sight of her in chains sent a jolt through him. She looked at him, and her eyes filled with a twisted, desperate version of love. "Damien," she whispered. "Thank God. You're all right. You have to tell them. Tell them she's lying. She did this to frame me, to get you all to herself." Damien stared at her, his face an unreadable mask of exhaustion and disgust. "Why, Isabel?" he asked, his voice raspy but strong. "Because I love you," she cried, the words echoing in the small room. "I've always loved you. You belong with me. In a world of excitement and power, not in that domestic prison with her I was trying to save you." He let the silence hang for a long moment, letting her desperate, delusional words dissipate. When he finally spoke, his voice was quiet, but each word was a hammer blow. "You never loved me," he said. "You loved the idea of me. You loved the power, the money, the name. You saw me as your final acquisition, and when you couldn't have me, you decided no one could. You tried to destroy the one pure thing in my life." He gestured weakly towards the door, where he knew Eleanor was waiting. "You didn't poison that pastry to save me. You did it because you lost." He looked away from her, then a final, complete dismissal. He looked at Detective Harding. "Get her out of my sight." As they led Isabel away, she screamed his name, a raw animal sound of pure rage and defeat. Damien didn't flinch. He just sat there, the weight of his own failure pressing down on him. 3 months later. Life did not return to normal. The fairy tale was dead, and its ashes had been scattered. Isabelle Dubois was denied bail, her trial a pending certainty that would dredge everything up again in the tabloids. Damien recovered his physical strength, but the psychic wounds remained. The trust between him and Eleanor was a fragile, crystalline thing shattered by the affair that he had deemed harmless. They talked for hours, painful, raw conversations filled with tears and brutal honesty. He laid bare his soul, his ambition, his loneliness, and the stupid, careless choices he had made before he truly understood what love was. She in turn confessed her fears, her insecurities, and the profound violation of knowing his past had almost destroyed their future. Their son, Arthur Vance Blackwood, was born on a crisp autumn afternoon. He was perfect. He had Damien's stormy grey eyes and Eleanor's calm, gentle spirit. In the quiet of the hospital room with the sprawling city lights glittering below, Damien held his son for the first time. He looked at Eleanor, who was watching them, a soft, weary smile on her face. The love he felt was overwhelming, a tidal wave of emotion so powerful it threatened to break him. It was not the triumphant, uncomplicated love of their old life. It was something different. It was a love forged in fire, tempered by betrayal, and scarred by immense pain. It was quieter, more somber, and infinitely more precious. He knew he would spend the rest of his life earning back the trust he had so carelessly broken. Their story wasn't a fairy tale anymore. It was real, and in the quiet, profound reality of holding his son and looking at his wife, his warrior, his survivor, Damien Blackwood finally understood that this messy, broken, beautiful reality was worth more than any perfect fantasy. Their future was uncertain, but for the first time, it was real. In the end, justice was served, but a perfect life was shattered forever. The poison was meant to destroy a family, but instead it exposed a truth that was just as toxic, that secrets are a poison of their own. Damien and Eleanor survived, but they were not unscathed. Their story is a chilling reminder that the greatest threats often come disguised as love, and that true strength isn't about having a perfect life, but having the courage to rebuild from the ashes. What do you think? Can trust, once broken so catastrophically, ever be truly restored? Let us know in the comments below. Thank you for watching. If this story captivated you, please hit that like button, share it with someone who loves a good drama, and be sure to subscribe and turn on notifications for more incredible stories you won't want to miss.